Palestinians, Iran, Lebanon, to name a few. And to break this down and more, we have senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy, Matthew Brodsky, joining us, and the president and CEO of the Democratic Majority for Israel, Mark Mellman. So let's begin with the always hot topic of the Middle East, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Has Trump's hardline approach to the Palestinians paved a pathway for future peace with Israel, in your opinions?
Well, from my perspective, what he did was provide an opportunity of the century, which was what the idea was to begin with. And that is for the Palestinian leadership to decide, of course, that rather than remaining comfortable with where they are, with their lot in life and the fact that their lives are okay no matter what it's like for their people, it was a choice that they could come to the table and negotiate. But absent that, which of course they boycotted this to begin with, which is, just like they did with Obama, of course, when he called for a settlement freeze and they didn't come to the table back in 2009, I believe it was. So the Trump administration wisely moved on to forge unity and consensus with other allies within the region that centered around Israel. It's kind of like President Trump had his own Israel test, if you will, which is if you like the United States, you want to have certain weapon systems from us, or you would like to be under our defensive umbrella, then you need to have a warm relationship with our most important ally in the region. Because if you're trying to undermine them and seek benefit from us, that's no longer going to work as it has for presidents in the past.
Now, what would Joe Biden's approach to the conflict look like if he were to be elected?
Well, I think Vice President Biden made a couple of things very clear during the course of this campaign. First of all, he strongly supported the efforts that President Trump was engaged in, and that the leaders of Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan were involved in, to create a normalization. Vice President Biden strongly backed those. There were a couple of Democrats who sounded discordant notes, but the Democrats backed them. Biden backed them strongest of all. So clearly wants to build on those efforts. The Vice President also has a view towards a two-state solution. He makes it very clear that he doesn't think that's anything that's going to happen soon, but he wants to make sure that the option remains, that the possibility remains for a two-state solution. And I think that's another part of his policy. But the third thing I think we have to recognize is that there are a lot of people in this country, in America, who are uncomfortable, potentially uncomfortable with the notion of arms sales to some of these countries. Not to say that people are opposed per se to sale of U.S. arms to the UAE or potentially to Saudi Arabia, but there's a lot of folks in this country who remember American troops fighting American weapons that found their way into the hands of the Taliban in Afghanistan when the people that we were supporting against the Soviets turned against us. And so there's a very strong bias among some people against using arms sales in unstable countries to further U.S. interests. So that's going to make things perhaps a little more complicated. But the reality is Vice President Biden stands strongly behind the normalization agreements and said they were historic and discussed just how important they were.
All right, so we're going to break in here. Before you respond, Matthew, we have some breaking news here. It looks like Biden is projected to win the state of Michigan. We're going to take a look at the map here. So this is obviously a very big win. We can see what's happening here. Right now, there are 253 projected seats for Democratic nominee Joe Biden, 213 for incumbent President Trump. All right, and with that, we are going back to our guests. The threat of Iran, Matthew, I know that you want to respond to what he was saying, but I would like to bring up Iran here because it's also just been a major issue for both Israel and the United States. Has Trump's also hardline maximum pressure approach been effective in your eyes?
Absolutely. My only argument would be that I wish he didn't appoint Secretary Tillerson and that we got this ball rolling far earlier on. And I can wrap up my response into this question by answering it this way. What you have is a fundamental difference in the way that Biden and President Trump read the region. I say that in part because when Biden was being in favor of the normalization plan. His actual tweet, the language he used in there was to say that this builds in the back of the Democrat and his administration, him and Obama's approach to the Middle East. It's a fundamental misreading of the entire region, just like it was with Iran. This happened as a direct repudiation of their approach. The Arab world and Israel grew closer together because of the fear of the horrible Iranian nuclear agreement, which leaves Iran a screws turn away from a nuclear weapon when that sunset clause disappears in a few years. So President Trump has not wanted to get into new wars, and he's the first president in a while who has avoided any military war type of situation. And instead, he's applied maximum economic pressure. If people like John Kerry didn't go out of their way, incidentally, to speak to Javad Zarif or Mahmoud Abbas and say, wait out the Trump administration, we could have probably reached a better agreement sooner. But that's why Trump thinks if he wins re-election, he will be much better positioned to make an agreement, because everyone who is our adversary will understand that it's going to be Trump in the White House for another 4 years.
Now, Mark, I'd like to give you the chance to respond there and also kind of give your take on how you think a Biden presidency is going to perhaps change the approach to Iran. He's spoken about getting back to the negotiating table with the Iranians.
Well, look, I guess Matt didn't catch the vice president's statement that the time for campaign slander is really over. We should be bringing the country together instead of making up false charges and arguments. But look, there's a fundamental reality here with vis-a-vis Iran. The simple fact is we can bemoan it, we can bewail it, we can say it's not Trump's fault, but the reality is Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon today than it has been at any point in the past. The last 4 years under Donald Trump, they've gotten closer. That's just a fact. Now, you can say that that's the result of a successful policy. I look at that outcome and say it can't be a very successful policy all in all. That's not to say it wasn't useful. It's not to say it's not important. It is to say it's hard to say that it's successful. What Vice President Biden has said is, we need to make sure that Iran does not obtain nuclear weapons. That is a strong, abiding commitment that he has made. And he's talked about the need to use any means necessary to prevent that from happening. But there is no question that it will require a negotiated agreement. There is no way that anybody can reasonably foresee that Iran is just going to stand up and say, we're going to give up nuclear weapons, the pursuit of nuclear weapons in exchange for nothing. That's just not a very likely outcome. So we have to have a deal with Iran. We have to have an agreement, but we have to have a better agreement than was negotiated before. And I think if you talk to people who are close foreign policy advisors to Vice President Biden, what they will tell you is that they understand that they need to negotiate a new and better agreement with Iran. Will the Iranians agree to it? We don't know, but we have to at least have the option. President Trump got out of the JCPOA without any plan to get a better deal. And so we're in a worse position. What Vice President Biden is saying is we need to get back in a better position.
All right, Matthew, quick sentence, quick response there, because we have to go out for a break.
Sure. I just think it's funny when we talk about how Biden's approach is going to be and what he wants to do. He's surrounded by the same exact advisors as under Obama. So to think that people that sold us down the river to get us a deal where they promised a whole lot and delivered literally nothing for the United States or the region, to think they're going to come up with something better or to entrust them, a little rich.
All right. Well, with that last comment, we are out for a short break. But when we are back, we're going